This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Summer has officially started for us and unofficially for the world. Memorial weekend is over. We will be, by the time this drops, done with our office duties. And I'm sure it's sun's out, guns out situation for you all as
right.
well. Yeah, so it'll be a happy summer.
It will be. In fact, I'm kind of hoping that gets here soon because it's still May at the moment we're recording. And I got a bunch of things I got to get done this week. I do not want anything hanging over my head at the beginning of June. So I'm going to knock all this stuff out. I'm going to make sure it's done so I can walk away. That's what I want.
Nice. I don't think I'll be walking away.
Nope.
No, not as VP.
But I look forward to this cold spell being over, or cold snap. What is this that we're in? Cold funk.
A little bit of a cold funk.
My
I
pool
call it
water,
spring.
My pool water was just getting to the
Michigan.
point where it was bearable to swim in, and then this happened. And so it set me back about 7 degrees.
Yeah, it has been brisk at night, which is great. I love windows open all the time situations, but
Well, and I'm happy for the rain because we need it, I'll tell you right now, everything's growing very well in the garden. So let the rain keep coming along. If that means a little bit of cool weather, I'm okay with it. But I don't have a pool to maintain.
It is still good timing for me because I planted grass seed about a week and a half ago.
Oh, okay.
And it's been nice not to have to water it twice a day for like several days because it's happening all natural.
yeah.
Oh, natural.
Other news, I don't know, a month or so ago, I talked about, I used one of our breaks to write a review of N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's book, Jesus and the Powers. And that is officially out. There's a link to it on the the After Class Podcast Facebook page.
Yep.
Or you can go to the Englewood Review of Books website and just do a search for my name and or Jesus and the Powers, and you should be able to. It was a feature review about a week or so ago, but some of you have reached out by email saying, hey, when's it going to be available? When's it going to be available? So that's finally available. And more importantly, did you have
I just want to know how many death threats you've gotten since you put that out. You're going against the big boy. So
no threats yet.
okay.
So we'll see. It's, May is a kind of a funny time where people are wrapping up and thinking about summer,
Mhm.
not thinking about scholarly debates as much.
All right, fair enough.
It could have been a more ideal time
Sure.
for me to drop something. But no, there's been no pushback from my pushback.
All right.
I've had several people reach out to me personally and just say, yeah, thanks for writing that. That needed to be said. Usually I love these guys. I don't know what they're thinking. So
Good.
so there were lots of relatively high-profile people reaching out to me, appreciating the review, and a lot of the readers and listeners. So
Glad to hear it.
Also, probably more importantly, my latest book called Priestly Presence, A Church for the World's Sake, has officially released, published by Fortress Press. It's available on their website. It's available on Amazon.com. And it's basically a description of how we might live out our kingdom of priest vocation and how Christians can have a vibrant witness to the world, how to negotiate our separation from the world, but our existence for the sake of the world.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a sequel to the Fourfold Office of Christ, because that book is kind of like a preface to it, kind of a scholarly background for this more practical application book. But it's also kind of a companion to Endangered Gospel.
Yeah.
Because that book really focused on living our life together as the people of God in such a way that's a witness. And this one focuses more on what does our life in relation to our unbelieving neighbors look like, and the unbelieving world around us look like. So the first book, I tried to have an equal balance of, in-house affection and outreach. But people said, yeah, there's a lot more in-house affection in that one than outreach. So this one is kind of skewed the other way. There's some in-house brotherly love, but definitely the emphasis is on reaching out how we relate to the wider world. So pick it up. It's easy to read book. It's really built for to be a great small group resource. Like the chapters, you can do a chapter a day in a small group and kind of work through the book, and it should promote lots of discussion and lots of practical suggestions on how to live out our faith.
Well, I hope it's a good tool for the church. I hope it's a meaningful tool that as people read it, they come to a better understanding of what our function is as the body, as representatives to the world. I like talking to people about how just our very lives together as community should be a living witness. That as people see the way we do life together, that the world should say, that is so weird, that is so different, but man, it sure works well. And to be inspired and invited to join with us, through the worship of Jesus. So hopefully it has that kind of an effect on people, on the church.
And I think the biggest core of the argument is, people often put a line, they don't know how to negotiate existing for the world but being separate from the world. It's kind of like to exist. It's kind of, people are like all or nothing. Either
Right,
I'm totally like helping the world, fixing the world, caring for the world, trying to make things better for the whole world, or I'm totally withdrawn in this kind of enclave, right, of separationism. But the model of Israel's priests, how they existed among the people of God in the Old Testament, they were separate from all the other Israelites, but it was very clear to them and all the other Israelites that their separation was for the sake of all the other Israelites. And that image becomes just a powerful model for how we relate to the world as Christians today. And it's the ecclesiology book that takes the Old Testament seriously, which is kind of my vocation. It's kind of my niche in ecclesiological studies is we have a whole Bible here we can use.
Right.
Let's not limit it to the book of Acts and a few letters from Paul.
I know, right? Yeah, the last quarter of the Bible.
Amen.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, today we are continuing our series on the Apocrypha, going through various books in the, often included in the, always included in Catholic Bibles.
Yep.
And at least included in the NRSV translation.
Right.
That you'll find of the scriptures. And today we're focusing on the additions to Esther. And so it's kind of an interesting book. It's called the Additions to Esther because it's not like it's similar to the additions to Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
You have the book of Esther, but you also have stuff along with it that's not in traditional Bibles.
Right. I mean, you have your Hebrew version of Esther that we're all familiar with, but then there's this Greek things that are like fit right in, but seemingly weren't part of the original.
Yeah.
And so historically, I mean, it was very clear that Esther existed at one point in its ordinary form that it shows up in most Protestant Bibles. And when Esther was translated into Greek, the ordinary book of Esther was translated into Greek, these other portions came with that translation.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you had a Greek translation of Esther in the first century, which would have been the only translation most churches in the western part of the empire had access to.
Right, yeah.
None of them were Hebrew speakers.
Yeah.
They would have probably had this version of Esther if they had access to an Esther scroll at all.
Yeah, they would probably be very surprised when they saw the Hebrew version. Like, when Jerome translates Esther from the Hebrew into Latin and they start reading it, they're like, wait a minute, there's pieces missing here. It'd be like if you read a Bible and the first part of John chapter 8 was just taken out. That whole story of the woman caught in adultery. If they just excised it from the Bible, you're like, where's the story? It's always been a part of John. And people could explain to you, well, the earliest, most reliable translations don't include it, but it would still feel really weird to you. And I'm sure for people who were used to the Greek Esther, going to the Hebrew version of it must have had that same jarring effect on them.
Yeah. And so Ron's talking about the late 4th century when Jerome translated the scriptures into Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back to the original.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't go from the Greek to Latin.
Yeah.
He went from the Hebrew for the Old Testament and the Greek for the New Testament into Latin. And so this choice of his to go from the Hebrew put him in a weird position with these books that have additions
Exactly.
that weren't in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
Right. And so he chose to translate the Hebrew and then add the stuff that's not in the Hebrew at the end of the book.
An appendix.
Yeah,
if you will.
it's like an appendix, so that people still had access to it in Latin, but he thought he would kind of highlight and showcase the primacy of the original Esther.
Yeah, and it does speak to the way, that we got our modern Bibles, at least in the West. The West is still very dedicated or very sort of dependent on its Catholic traditions, the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church used the Latin for a long time. And eventually, we started getting English translations, but they were indebted to that Latin translation. Versus the East, that just always used the Greek because they were Greek speakers. And so you have these two different Bibles that the two different churches, the East and West churches, are using. And it tells you a lot about the history of translation. It's fascinating for anybody who wants to really dig into it to understand it better. It's not right or wrong. It's just the choices that were made by the church that echo, thousands of years later.
Yeah. So our approach is going to be to kind of read for you the additions portions and talk about them some, like what do they add, what's going on here, and then kind of summarize. We're going to read it the way it shows up in the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll kind of read the portion, and then we'll summarize, because you should be familiar with the ordinary portions that are in ordinary Protestant Bibles, right? And we'll kind of
the
summarize
canonical
those portions,
some might say,
right, as opposed to the deuterocanonical,
right?
And then when we get to the next Greek portion, we'll slow down and read it, discuss it a little bit, summarize from the Hebrew version, and then go on until we work our way through the book.
We'll do our best.
You'll be exposed to most of the content of these editions and get to ask the question along with us, what does this add?
Mm-hmm.
How is this different than the version that we're used to?
Yeah.
All right, so we begin at the beginning of our version, edition A. It says, in the second year of the reign of Artaxerxes the Great, on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man serving in the court of the king. He was one of the captives whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had brought from Jerusalem with King Jeconiah of Judea. And this was his dream: noises and confusions, thunders and earthquake, tumult on the earth. Then two great dragons came forward, both ready to fight, and they roared terribly. At their roaring, every nation prepared for war to fight against the righteous nation. It was a day of darkness and gloom, of tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult on the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them, and were ready to perish. Then they cried out to God, and at their outcry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted and devoured those held in honor. Mordecai saw in this dream what God had determined to do, and after he woke, he had it in his mind, seeking all day to understand it in every detail. And then Mordecai took his rest in the courtyard with Gabbatha and Thara, the two eunuchs of the king who kept watch in the courtyard. He overheard their conversation and inquired into their purposes, and learned that they were preparing to lay hands on King Artaxerxes, and he informed the king concerning them. Then the king examined the two eunuchs, and after they had confessed it, they were led away to execution. The king made a permanent record of these things, and Mordecai wrote an account of them. And the king ordered Mordecai to serve in the court and rewarded him for these things. But Haman, son of Hammedatha, Boogian, not a boogeyman, a Boogian, who was in great honor with the king, determined to endure Mordecai and his people because of the two eunuchs of the king. So this is some of you are like, what are we talking about here, right? It gives a little background of Mordecai, and then he has this crazy dream, and then it switches quickly to something that probably sounds sort of familiar from the Esther story that you know, but some other interesting details found within.
Yeah. Well, and this is where now Mordecai is starting to sound more like Bible characters that we recognize. It sounds very Joseph-like, maybe a little bit Daniel-like.
Mm-hmm.
Just this idea of having dreams, interpreting the dreams. That's big in the story of Joseph and big in the story of Daniel. And I wonder if whoever wrote the editions just felt like we need to up his honor a little bit. Let's make Mordecai a bigger figure. And what better way to do it than to make him like these great figures from Israel's history, Joseph and Daniel. I don't know, but it just seems like that might have been the motivation behind the stories like this.
Yeah. And if you guys, I'm sure many of the readers have read Esther, but if you haven't or you've forgotten, we actually did an episode on the movie One Night with the King, which is based on the book of Esther, and we followed the plot. So the book ordinarily starts with the king, Artaxerxes,
the big party,
having a banquet, and he summons Vashti, and she doesn't come, and he gets all ticked and has to replace her as queen.
Yeah.
But this doesn't start with the Persian Empire. It starts with the Jewish people.
Yeah.
There is a pious Jew and a spiritual man, because he has dreams that have revelatory significance. And so this dream has, two dragons that are battling.
I love the dragons.
We got nations against a righteous nation, and then this tiny little spring that becomes a great river and settles the score.
Yeah,
right,
weirdly.
somehow.
Yeah.
And so we could all speculate what the dragons mean and what this tiny river is and what the nations are and the righteous nation. But we're going to hold that off because the book of Esther in the Greek ends with the interpretation of the dream.
Yeah.
So you can speculate what you think it is, and he'll go on to the story, and then at the end we'll let the narrator tell us what this dream meant.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre beginning from what most of us know as the Esther story. Like, it's very apocalyptic, which, of course,
Yeah.
the book of Esther is not at all like that.
Right.
And so this weird sort of beginning, and like, oh, okay, guess we're going to go with that. And we're going to see it bookended, like you say, sort of a ring device of how the whole story comes together at the end.
Yeah. And Ron mentioned a little bit of what that adds to the story. I think one of the things that's really stands out in the book of Esther, and we're going to see addressed in these editions, is the book of Esther doesn't mention the name of God.
Exactly.
It's like God's not overtly involved in the book of Esther.
Right.
And with this dream, this seems like a God dream,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
Daniel dream, right? A Joseph dream. And in fact, it has the people crying out to God.
Mm-hmm.
And then God responds with this tiny spring. And so right off the bat, it sounds a little bit more like the other books of the Old Testament.
Right.
Yeah.
That this book is about God and his people.
Yep.
Whereas the book of Esther otherwise just seems like God's people
Yeah.
trying to survive without much help from God.
Right.
All right, you want to summarize what happens in between?
You started that already, but we got the feasts, we got the Vashti situation. So she's brought in, or she's supposed to be brought in to parade herself. She doesn't do it. The king kicks her out, which of course then leads to the Miss Persia contest, which we know that Esther in fact wins. So we're introduced to this Jew Mordecai, who is also talked about as being kind of an important figure. Pious figure. You're introduced to Esther, and she wins. And in the midst of that is the whole eunuch plot, but this one's a little different. There's these two eunuchs. Mordecai hears about it, but instead of like tattling on them to the king, he goes through Esther as an intermediary, and it gets taken care of. But there's no reward given to him. It's just sort of written down somewhere, which of course we know is going to come back up later. In chapter 3, we are then introduced to Haman, who's then elevated as he goes up to the kingship. And in the midst of it, he has his bad interaction with Mordecai. Mordecai doesn't give him the obeisance he thinks he deserves. And it's gonna set up the whole the tension, the conflict for the rest of the book between Haman and the Jewish people.
Right.
Yeah, since Mordecai has the favor of the king, and now not Mordecai, Haman has the favor of the king, and the king wants to honor him. Haman basically says, hey, there's this nation, the Jewish people, who just don't play along, don't play nicely. They're not a good addition to the kingdom.
Yeah.
We have to do something to get rid of them. And the king agrees and then sends out this letter. And, in the Protestant Bibles, you don't actually have the content of the letter, but in the Greek editions, we do. So.
Yep.
Ron, you want to read the king's letter?
I will read the king's letter. This is a copy of the letter. The great king Artaxerxes writes the following to the governors of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia and to the officials under them. Having become ruler of many nations and master of the whole world, not elated with presumption of authority, but always acting reasonably and with kindness. I love that parenthetical
Yes.
response
Right.
here. Not too arrogant about this thing, though I rule the whole world. Don't forget that. I have determined to settle the lives of my subjects in lasting tranquility, and in order to make my kingdom peaceable and open to travel throughout all of its extent, to restore the peace desired by all people. When I asked my counselors how this might be accomplished, Haman, I always say Haman, but Haman, like you guys, who excels among us in sound judgment and is distinguished for his unchanging goodwill and steadfast fidelity, and has attained the second place of honor in the kingdom, pointed out to us that among all the nations in the world there is scattered a certain hostile people who have laws contrary to those of every nation, and continually disregard the ordinances of the kings, so that the unifying of the kingdom that we honorably intend cannot be brought about. We understand that this people, and it alone, stands constantly in opposition to all humanity, perversely following a strange manner of life and laws, and is ill disposed to our interests, doing all the harm they can so that our kingdom may not attain stability. Therefore, we have decreed that Therefore, we have decreed that those indicated to you in the letters written by Haman, who is in charge of the affairs and is our second father, shall all, wives and children included, be utterly destroyed by the swords of their enemies, without pity or restraint, on the 14th day of the 12th month, Adar, of this present year, so that those who have long been hostile and remain so may in a single day go down in violence to Hades and leave our interests secure and untroubled hereafter.
What a letter.
That is a harsh letter. Well, and I could like preach sermons out of this letter, in terms of how the world often views the people of God. Like, we're just trying to make peace and bring unity and all this stuff. And it does make me think of like even, the Maccabean period, which we'll talk about at a later time. But the whole idea is we want unity and peace, and we're just trying to do what's good for everybody. And darn these rebellious people who are upsetting everything and keeping us from achieving all of our grandiose goals. Man, for those people out there listening, how often do Christians feel like this is how we're portrayed? We're just getting in the way of the great and noble aspirations of all the world. That's why I love this letter, because I'm like, this is often how the world looks at us. We are the speed bumps keeping them from achieving their goals.
Yeah. It's an interesting insight into how Jews interpreted the hostility of the world to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it says something about their own self-identity. Like, yeah, we do have separate laws. We do live a different way. We do stand in the way of the unification of the empire.
Yeah.
As like one united nation,
Yep.
right? A one united kingdom, with the same language, with the same custom, with the same laws. Like, the empire wants unity through uniformity,
Mm-hmm.
and the Jews have been called by God to live out a separate life,
Yeah.
different from the world around them.
Yep.
And so that puts them at odds.
Yeah.
And, it's not like the Jews say, you're totally wrong about that. We're team players. We want to do everything
Right.
you want to do. We live for the unity of the Persian Empire.
Right. Yeah.
That's not the case.
Yep.
They don't apologize for this, but they just recognize this is how they're perceived.
Yep.
They wouldn't say they're trying to stand in the way of the peace and tranquility of the empire. They would say that we are trying to show the empire what true peace looks like.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
what they call peace is actually violence.
Yep.
And so I think it's just an interesting description.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead. I was
No.
going to say, it makes me think of, in James, when James talks about friendship with the world is hostility towards God. And, I think modern people understand that to a degree, of course, but this passage makes me understand it in a much more robust way. That for James, he's thinking about these kinds of examples from Israel's history about what friendship with the world looks like. In exile, Israel learned we are not friends with the world. Friendship with the world got us into this problem. We will no longer be friends with the world. And so their radical departure from the world's objectives have created this tension that is now reflected in this letter.
And if the writing of this is after 200, which more than likely it is, this is all in the midst of Hellenization
Yep.
and all the difficulties that they're going
Yeah.
to go through, which you said we're going to talk about when we get to the Maccabees.
Right,
But
yeah.
like it makes perfect sense to be in this time period. It's just another reminder that's maybe not as overt of their call to be different and to stay true to Torah, even if it causes problems for the empire.
Amen. Amen.
And like you said, friendship with the world is enmity with God, and
Mhm.
friendship with God is enmity with the
Right.
world.
Yeah.
There's a flip side of this,
Yeah.
and this book really captures that.
I agree.
Well, after Mordecai learns of this decree that went out, he's nervous.
To say
Nice
the
way of
There's
putting
going to
it,
be
sure.
genocide on the people, and,
Yeah.
and he petitions Esther, hey, you've got to do something about this. You're married to the king who wrote this letter.
Yeah.
And so he petitions her. And then we have the next round of additions, which is really two prayers, one from Mordecai and one from Esther. I'll read the first one, and we'll talk briefly about it, and then we'll pivot to Sam for the second one.
Sure thing.
So here's Mordecai. Just so after he's talked with Esther, and Esther agrees to be a team player,
Mhm.
then we have this prayer. Then Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling to remembrance all the works of the Lord. He said, O Lord, Lord, King of all powers, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. You are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. You know all things. You know, O Lord, that it was not in insolence or pride or for any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to this proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did this so that I might not set human glory above the glory of God. And I will not bow down to anyone but you, who are my Lord. And I will not do these things in pride. And now, O Lord God and King, God of Abraham, spare your people, for the eyes of our foes are upon us to annihilate us, and they desire to destroy the inheritance that has been yours from the beginning. Do not neglect your portion, which you redeemed for yourself out of the land of Egypt. Hear my prayer and have mercy upon your inheritance. Turn our mourning into feasting, that we may live and sing praise to your name, O Lord. Do not destroy the lips of those who praise you. And all Israel cried out with all their might, for their death was before their eyes. So, his prayer kind of sounds a little bit like the king's decree. It's not out of pride that I do this.
Right.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah.
But I think
Humility.
he's answering a perceived objection. Like, dude, we're all going to get killed because you wouldn't humble yourself before one single dude. Now
Yeah.
we're all going to get killed. And I think he's answering that objection. Like, no, this isn't about me and my pride. This is about God and his glory and his honor. He is Lord. There is no other Lord. And someone else is putting themselves before us as Lord. Like, Lord is the most repeated word in this chapter.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And this is where Mordecai, in many ways, he's kind of performing a prophetic role with the people to help them to understand the true nature of the situation. You're right. They probably are looking at him as the cause of this. And it's just like, do what you got to do. We just need to survive. We don't want to die. Just do what you got to do. And he's like, no, I'm going to remind you of what our purpose is. Our purpose is to honor God in everything. And honoring God sometimes means putting you in tension with the rest of the world. And honoring God means when our lives are in danger, we cry out to the very God that we are trying to serve.
Yeah, this is interesting because there are other times in the Old Testament where they would bow down to humans. Obviously, bowing down to idols and other gods is strictly forbidden, but it's not like it's unheard of. And so it's like, dude, just fall in line. It's fine. And he's like, no, I have my integrity. If I have nothing else, okay, man. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, the whole justifying why he did what he did, because most people don't look at Mordecai as the bad guy, but when you look at it that way, like practically, man, it's just a simple thing, and we're not all dead. Like I don't get it, and so that is kind of a apologetic for his actions.
Yeah.
Well, we also have Esther's response. It says this: Then Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on the garments of distress and mourning. And instead of costly perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dung. She utterly humbled her body. Every part that she loved to adorn she covered with her tangled hair. She prayed to the Lord God of Israel and said, O my Lord, you only are our king. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations, and our ancestors from among all our forebears, for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised. And now we have sinned before you, and you have handed us over to our enemies because we glorified their gods. You are righteous, O Lord, and now they are not satisfied that we are in bitter slavery, but they have covenanted with their idols to abolish what your mouth has ordained and destroy your inheritance, to stop the mouths of those who praise you, and to quench your altar and the glory of your house, and to open the mouths of the nations for the praise of vain idols, and to magnify forever a mortal king. O Lord, do not surrender your scepter to what has no being, and do not let them laugh at our downfall, but turn their plan against them, and make an example of them, and who began this against us. Remember, O Lord, make yourself known in this time of our affliction, and give me courage, O King of the gods and Master of all dominion. Put eloquent speech in my mouth before the lion, and turn his heart to hate the man who is fighting against us, so that there may be an end of him and those who agree with him. But save us by your hand, and help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, O Lord. You have knowledge of all things, and you know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any alien. You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on days which I appear public. I abhor it like a filthy rag, and I do not wear it on the days when I am at leisure. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and I have not honored the king's feast or drunk the wine of libations. Your servant has had no joy since the day that I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord, God of Abraham. O God, whose might is over all, hear the voice of the despairing, and save us from the hands of the evildoers, and save me from my fear! Exclamation point.
The end.
So this gives a little more to what Esther did than we see in the original version. Like the way she just sort of dresses down and she joins Mordecai and some of the other Jews in their lamenting garb. We think of like sackcloth and ashes. It uses the word dung. I would be skeptical that she's putting dung on her because that's unclean, but it's fine. It's possible. And her prayer is very, it's very sort of orthodox way of describing God. You who helped our forefathers and forebears, we praise you. However, we sinned and you punished us, but don't forget us. Come back and save us. And then she gets kind of specific, like turn against these people who are against us specifically. The last part, I think, is again, an apologetic, because one could say, you're a sellout, Esther.
You're right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You married this foreign king. You're all in the foreign court. Like,
You're in bed with an uncircumcised man.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And she's like, I don't like it.
I derive no joy from this whatsoever.
Yeah. And she says things like, I haven't done this. I haven't done that.
I haven't eaten the food.
Yeah.
I haven't drank the wine.
Yeah. So, and I only put it on when in public, but during the normal days, I'm like, I'm just a normal average Jew,
Yep. Only when they force me to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean,
no, that's fine.
okay. I didn't want to interrupt you, but no, like not eating the food or drinking the wine takes me back to like Daniel chapter 1. It's like this, this horrible Persian food. I want nothing to do with it. But no, I think you made a really good point, Sam, that I think that reading the traditional Esther that we're used to in our English Bibles, you might think that, well, she didn't want to be queen, but it turned out pretty well for her. No, she doesn't like this. She is a good Jew who wants no part of being in the royal entourage. And this prayer reveals her true heart. Only when I'm in public, but never when I get to take this stuff off.
Yeah. So just like Mordecai's prayer kind of defends him from charges of impiety, so her prayer kind of shows her true intentions, and that what people may have feared she had done while in the king's court, she actually hadn't done.
Right.
So both are really apologetic.
Yeah.
And both of them, again, include God in the plot in a very overt way.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. That now, one of the main points people always make about Esther is God's never mentioned. And here in the editions, God plays a huge role, even by name. And so, well, I mean, it's in Greek, so it's not really Yahweh in there. But the idea that he is acknowledged overtly seems to solve the the atheistic nature, quote unquote atheistic nature of the traditional Esther.
Yeah. And the other one you can say, well, all the people fasted.
Sure.
But, they did that in Nineveh too.
Yeah.
So fasting is not a sign, oh, look, this is an overt appealing to the God of Israel. But here, even though they don't use the divine name here in Greek, they do say the God who delivered the people from Egypt.
Right, yeah.
So he is named very overtly. They're not praying to some generic God over the Persian Empire.
Right.
They're praying specifically to the God of Israel. So this prayer, both these prayers are followed by another edition, which we're not going to read. It just basically tells the story of Esther came before the king trembling to give her message, and he was gentle and it received her, and she fainted, and then it kind of picks up where the book kind of the ordinary Esther leaves off with him asking what the requests are, and then things developing from there, and how she kind of outs Haman as the one who is the enemy of her people, and then the king is mortified at Haman and then brings judgment upon him, and then reverses Haman's decree to exterminate all Jews, and allows the Jewish people to continue in their livelihood. And instead, those who would go against the Jewish people, those are the ones who have to worry for their lives.
Yep.
So the next edition is the decree of Artaxerxes. So I don't know, Sam, if you want to kind of paraphrase it or read selectively parts of it,
Okay.
or is it
Not ready
Ron's
for that.
turn?
It is
actually?
my
It is
turn.
Ron's turn.
sorry.
But I don't
That's
care.
fine.
Doesn't matter to me.
None of us are ready for that.
I sprung it on us.
Well, it starts similarly to the last one. Like, hey, this is King Artaxerxes. I'm the man. I've done all these things. And again, it's a lot of rhetoric, which very
is, yeah.
Greek. Sorry, very Greek sounding. The beginning part, right? About
Yep.
all these like nice things to say about me and God. But he's like, but you know what? There's this guy in our midst. You may have heard of him, Haman. And it's very like it's almost like we ignore the fact of what he did before. Before he's like, he's the best guy ever. You should listen to him.
Right.
And then I will read that. Look at verse 15. Well, you don't have verses. But we find that the Jews, who were consigned to annihilation by this thrice accursed man, are not evildoers, but are governed by most righteous laws and are children of the living God, most high, most mighty, who has directed the kingdom both for us and for our ancestors in the most excellent order. It's like a big turn of events.
Yeah.
And he actually extols Mordecai and turns his back on Haman and basically says, we're killing Haman. It's over. It's so and I'm going to read how it ends too.
Can you go back and read 10 too?
I was
sure.
looking at that as well.
sorry.
He
Sure.
says something kind of funny there
Yeah.
too.
For Haman, son of Hamadatha, a Macedonian, really an alien to the Persian blood and quite devoid of our kindliness, having become our guest, and then like he did all these things.
Yeah. He's
Yeah.
not even a real Persian. He's a Macedonian.
Yeah. And
Well,
so-
and if this is written in the 2nd century, the Persians were conquered by not just the Greeks, but specifically the Macedonians. And so it kind of takes on a whole new, flavor that way.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And then I'll just say, verse towards the end says, "Therefore you shall observe this with all good cheer as a notable day among your commemorative festivals. So both now and hereafter it may represent deliverance for you and the loyal Persians, but there may be a reminder of the destruction of those who plot against us." And that's exactly what it came to be. Is this, the Purim becomes part of the calendar, the festivals and calendar. And so, just a justification of why we do what we do. Reminds us of that.
So it's so. I mean, what's interesting about this, like Persians boast themselves on having laws that don't change.
Yeah.
Like they have a decree and it's set, and they can't go against the decree. So much so that in the book of Daniel, like the king's advisors try to use that policy against the king, right, to trap Daniel, whom the king had favor, right, with whom the king had favor. And so, but here he's doing it a direct reversal, which is kind of a mockery of the so-called eternal decrees of the Persians.
Right. Yeah.
Like they say something and they uplift this guy as basically walking on water. Then they turn on him and he's a traitor of the empire. He's a Macedonian sympathizer. He never belonged to us.
Right.
And I think this is where we do have a kind of a change from the book of Esther, because the book of Esther really emphasized Haman's descent from the Amalekites.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, yeah,
Right, to bring up this kind of ancient battle between the Jews coming out of Egypt and the Amalekites who tried to take them out even before they got to Mount Sinai. And then there's this kind of tension between them that God puts there and says, I'm going to punish the Amalekites and we're going to remove them from the face of the earth for what they've done. And so like Haman's origins, at least in the Hebrew version, focus on that ancient rivalry. Right. And then Mordecai is a descendant of Saul, who was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, but didn't. And that's what sets up the whole story. But here, again, it's located many centuries later, and we're in a Macedonian, Greek, Persian context. And so, at least from the king's perspective, this isn't about some ancient rivalry between the Jews and the Amalekites. This is about Haman, who's not a true Persian.
Right.
And which is really his beef against the Jews.
Right.
They're not team players. They're not real Persians, and they're standing in the way of the unity of the empire. Well, with Haman, he is not a true Persian. He's more of a Macedonian sympathizer, and really what he's trying to do is subvert what we've got going on.
Yep.
And so the same charge he leveled against the Jews, he now levels against Haman.
And there's a great poetic irony for the reader to see that happening to him. It's like, yep, the very thing you try to use against us is going to turn against you. I'm sure there was a lot of cheering whenever this was read out loud.
Oh,
in the
sure.
synagogue.
Yeah. So what happens after this is, of course, the copies are disseminated, and the day of judgment comes, and the Jews are not wiped out. Instead, they have vengeance on their enemies. And then they established the festival of Purim as a lasting ordinance. And see, this whole reversal of readings allows you, Ron, to kind of end with the
Woohoo!
dream.
Yes.
The dream's interpretation, which is the last edition that we have that would occur after the ordinary book of Esther would end.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And Mordecai said, "These things have come from God, for I remember the dream that I had concerning these matters, and none of them has failed to be fulfilled. There was a little spring that became a river, and there was light and sun and abundant water. The river is Esther, who the king married and made queen. The two dragons are Haman and myself. The nations are those that gathered to destroy the name of the Jews. And my nation, this is Israel, who cried out to God and was saved. The Lord has saved his people. The Lord has rescued us from all these evils. God has done great signs and wonders, wonders that have never happened among the nations. For this purpose he made 2 lots, one for the people of God and one for the nations. And these 2 lots came to the hour and moment and to the day of judgment before God and among all the nations. And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance. So they will observe these days in the month of Adar, on the 14th and 15th of that month, with an assembly and joy and gladness before God, from generation to generation, forever among his people Israel."
And the postscript?
Oh, sorry. I thought I reached the end of it. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought to Egypt the preceding letter about Purim, which they said was authentic and had been translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. Thank you. I kind of missed that part.
Not a big deal.
It's not in the original.
Yeah.
So it just stands out as being a little postscript, which I think the fact that it really adds nothing to the story maybe does give us some insight into what happened with this letter.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
how and it makes sense, that it's going to Egypt, and Egypt at this point is really becoming a hub of Egyptian Greek
Yeah, Greek.
culture.
Yeah.
Right. And then, it's from Egypt that we probably have this massive amount of Greek translations happening.
Exactly.
And so the tie here kind of gives us a little historical insight.
Yeah, Egypt, especially Alexandria, was like the Harvard or the Oxford of its day. And so it's not surprising to see this connected with Egypt, especially because of the Greek culture. It's not Egyptian culture, it's Greek culture.
Yeah.
And a couple centuries before Jesus' birth, especially.
Yeah, so we got the dream description here, the interpretation. So the river was Esther.
Oh, who could have known?
That's cute.
Didn't see that coming.
I like how they called Mordecai a dragon, though.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
it's,
actually unusual.
It's kind of a fun thing, the 2 dragons going at it, and then it just sort of brings together all that we know and all that we've seen. And what I like here is that there's kind of a play in word, like there's these 2 lots that are out there, a lot in life, but also the lot, the casting of lots, and it just reminds them that, like, yes, you Jews, God's not done with you yet. God has a plan for you in this world, and just keep that in mind. He's remembered you, He's vindicated you, and so whenever you celebrate Purim, you remember that God's still using you. And so again, depending upon the time period, it's reminding them, like, yeah, stay true, like Mordecai, like Esther, and see what God will do.
Yeah, and it's a message, I think, that echoes to this very day. It's that same message about remaining faithful, even in the face of not just overt hostility, but possible death. But it's a message of trusting God, that God cares so much about the program that He's put into motion that He's going to ensure it continues. He's not going to let His people be destroyed. But God will always intervene to protect His people, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the bigger plan that He has, which is to continue to proclaim this, new and better kingdom to the world.
Yeah. It's important that He's not just protecting His people who are in Palestine, close to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like Esther really is, both in the Bible and in the Deuterocanonical version, it shows how God looks after His scattered exilic people.
Yep.
They haven't stopped being His people that He seeks to protect
Yeah.
and who have a special vocation because they no longer live in Palestine.
Right. Yep.
And I think that's a huge message that the book of Esther has. And it's a key message to understand in the Bible.
Yep.
We tend to think that the Bible story just runs to Jerusalem. like to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem and back to Jerusalem. Everything's about Jerusalem, and some people are still obsessed about Jerusalem today,
Right.
right? But really, Esther shows that God's story is so much bigger than just Jerusalem.
Yeah.
It still has a part to play, right? It's going to be the launching pad for Christian mission. But the outposts that make Christian mission possible are these scattered exiled Jews
Yeah.
who form the synagogues that become central to Paul's church planting strategy.
Yep.
So the scattered Jews have a role, and God's looking after them, and the stationary Palestine-centric Jews have a certain role, and God looks after them too.
Yep.
And this gives the book of Esther, its Greek form, a nice ring device.
Yep.
Kind of starts with a dream, ends with a dream. I don't think the additions were all that. They didn't do too much to change the story.
Mm-mm.
There's definitely a lot more of God in it.
Yep. In that
Um,
there's any. Yep.
right? It's
Right.
definitely apologetic, defending the Jewish characters from charges that maybe they were sellouts. The Persian decrees didn't add a whole lot,
Right.
except maybe some perspective.
Yeah, it reminds me of like a screenplay of something. Like you have a story, but then to make it go to the screen, you have to add in some details and things that aren't necessarily there, but are not like against it. And so, adding in more details of what Mordecai did or said or thought, that's the sort of thing you would have when you converted something right to a movie or to TV. And that's the feel I get from these is they're not like contradicting anything. It's just it adds a little more color and flesh to the story that we already have.
Yeah, and there's some pretty good symmetry to it. We have the two dreams, we have the two decrees, we have the two prayers.
Yeah.
Except that one addition that I skipped over, it didn't really have a counterpart.
Yeah.
A pair. There was kind of an aesthetic beauty to how they laid out the book.
Yep.
But like message wise, I think, and the only thing that really changes is we've removed ourselves a bit from the ancient rivalry
Yeah.
with the Amalekites. That's no longer highlighted, in this version of the story. And arguably, Mordecai gets a lot more press in this version than in the other
without a
one.
doubt.
He has the two dreams.
Yeah, and just the overt, like, God's doing all this. Like, the canonical version is like, yeah, he's in the background, and we all let the reader understand. But here, it's very clear. They're praying to God. God do this, God do that, and God did it. And like, yay, God. And so it's just making clear what was kind of hidden under the surface in the other version.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's not called Mordecai and Esther.
Yeah.
With the role that he plays. Instead of just being Esther, it should be Mordecai and Esther.
Yeah, and I think, there are other, I forget where it shows up. It's in one of the other Second Temple works. They refer back to this feast as Mordecai's Day, the Day of Mordecai. And so, yeah, he was a prominent figure in the Jewish imagination. And
Yeah.
I don't know if this book kind of raised his profile as a prominent figure.
Could be.
Anything in here that you found sketchy or unorthodox? A reason why? Boy, it's a good thing these editions aren't in our versions of the Bible, or else we'd all be worshiping Mary. we have to do the orthodoxy check after we read each one of these.
Not really.
No.
I mean, I think there's a very Greek influence in it. And I don't love that, but it's not like objectionable. It's just you see that some of the societal changes and the things that Greeks did, like elevating a people. Like they would be happy to write a great thing about a person, and this is not that exactly like I said Mordecai, but it's in that direction. But nothing like super objectionable that I can think of.
I agree. Nothing stands out. Kind of going back to what you said there, Sam, does it elevate Mordecai? Like, the great thing about Esther is that Mordecai isn't really highly elevated, and Esther is. It is maybe it's a little bit more countercultural, with Mordecai playing a role, but Esther having that central place in it. But that's really kind of picking at the details. It's not really an objection.
Yeah, there's definitely a contextualizing of the book for a Greek
Mm-hmm.
audience. And so it does have more of a Greek feel than a Jewish feel. But I think content-wise, if anything, it makes the book more orthodox, not less.
Sure.
Because the other book was open, the Jewish version, the Hebrew version, was open to charges of, look, Jews can intermarry with foreigners.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, there's no evidence that she had to, reject Greek or Persian culture. Look, there's not a whole lot of divine providence,
Mm-hmm.
And so this book, in some way, seeks to make it more orthodox,
Yeah.
not less.
Agree.
And whether something is lost in there, I think maybe something is, right? Where
Yeah.
the other book, you had to say, you know what? God was involved in the life of his people, even when it wasn't overt and obvious to those people.
Yeah.
We see his hand at work when we don't have dreams and visions and prophets.
Right.
You know, that's part of the message that gets lost
Mhm.
when we have dreams and visions and prophets.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? So there's a little bit of disconnect for those of us who don't experience all those dreams.
Yeah, like Esther is the book for the common Christian, so to speak, in the sense of like, I don't have a burning bush experience. I don't have this and that. I have a faithful God who is always working behind the scenes that I don't always see,
Yeah.
right? And so that gets lost, and that's kind of disappointing. But I mean, it doesn't change the message. God's still working, but
Right.
the overt attribution of that in these editions changes how we read the book.
Agree.
All right.
All right. Well, that's another deuterocanonical book down. We'll pick up another one next time. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen.
After clock. Class. Read Tobit.
Thank you again for listening to the Afterclass podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.